On a bitterly cold winter morning in Pine Grove, the snow-covered pine forest still lay in silence, the sun yet to pierce through the thick gray clouds above. The stillness was so complete that one could hear the crisp snap of branches beneath the heavy snow, the faint breathing of hidden forest creatures, and the tiny footsteps of a boy wandering along a familiar trail. Liam Carter, 6 years old, stood out in his bright red parka against the blanket of white, his rubber boots sinking ankle-deep into the frozen ground, each step leaving a mark in the icy crust. He neither spoke nor sang, simply observing the forest with the quiet intensity of someone listening to something grown-ups could never perceive. Then suddenly, a thunderous crack tore through the trees, a gunshot that shattered the early morning stillness and roused Pine Grove from its slumber. Liam froze, his small heart pounding. He had never heard such a violent sound in this place before. Before he could regain his senses, a second shot echoed through the bare trees, startling a flock of forest birds into the sky, spiraling in panic like shards of black paper against the ashen sky. The sound didn't just rupture the peace of the woods, it pierced something fragile deep inside the boy's heart. Ahead, behind a line of pine trees, a tall steel fence loomed, and behind it, a massive dark figure growled in desperate defiance. 3 men in camouflage, rifles slung over their backs, moved cautiously down the snow-covered slope, closing in on the creature trapped behind the barrier. Their eyes were tense, weapons at the ready, one of them calling out, voice tight with fear, "It's dangerous, be careful." But at that very moment, something completely unexpected happened. From below the slope, Liam suddenly bolted forward, a red streak against the grayscale canvas of the deep forest. "Kid, get back!" one of the hunters shouted, panic rising in his voice, but the boy didn't stop. If anything, the gunshot seemed to propel him faster. Snow sprayed behind him, and wind lashed at his face, but Liam charged toward the fence, toward the snarling creature hunched inside as though drawn to its final moment. He stopped just inches from the steel barrier. Inside, the massive black beast, sharp white fangs bared, golden eyes glinting like molten metal, froze. Its breath came in steaming clouds, ears pricked, limbs locked as if frozen. Liam didn't cry or tremble. Instead, he lifted his small arm, reaching out with his hand. His voice rang out, calm yet commanding. "He's mine. His name is Shadow." No one spoke, not a branch stirred. Time itself seemed to stop. The men with rifles exchanged baffled glances while the creature, no longer a cornered wild animal, slowly lowered its body, tail drooping, eyes no longer burning with rage, but glowing with the gaze of a soul that had found its anchor. In that instant, something unnameable passed between a boy and a giant black wolf, a silent thread that connected them, beyond logic, beyond language, species, or law. No one understood why Liam dared to approach, but to him, there was nothing to fear, because in his young heart, he knew something adults didn't. Shadow wasn't just a pet, he was a part of Liam, of his blood, his soul, the call from the wild that he had always heard in silence. No one in the forest, not even the armed men hardened by years of hunting and danger, could explain why a 6-year-old boy would walk up to a creature they believed was a monster. But for Rachel Carter, clinging to the chain-link fence at the bottom of the slope, it was more than terror. It was a miracle. The child who had lived for 6 silent years like a ghost was now standing with arms outstretched, shielding a wolf. No hesitation, no fear. Just a boy who looked like he had known the creature behind him his whole life, not with his mind, but with his heart. Liam Carter wasn't like other children. He didn't laugh at his mother's voice, didn't clap to music, never played with classmates, or responded when called. From the earliest days, Rachel sensed something was different. He didn't react to light, didn't meet her gaze while feeding, and later wouldn't touch anyone, not even the warm hand of the woman who gave him life. Doctors diagnosed him with severe autism spectrum disorder, making communication, both verbal and emotional, nearly impossible. And yet, not a single night passed without Rachel sitting at his bedside, whispering wishes for a miracle. After the death of Mark, her husband, a woodsman killed when a tree fell during a storm, Rachel had to be both mother and keeper of the small veterinary clinic the couple had built when they first moved to Pine Grove. It was a small town where everyone knew each other, where rumors traveled faster than wind, and where different wasn't always welcomed. Liam grew up under curious glances, pitying whispers, and the quiet avoidance of parents whose children weren't invited to birthdays because of that strange kid in class. And as if to mark his difference even more clearly, Liam bore a rare birthmark, a perfect wolf paw on his left wrist. It wasn't faded like most pigmentation. It was sharp, distinct, every toe and claw clearly outlined. A dermatologist dismissed it as an unusual but harmless anomaly, but Frank Weston, the reclusive man who ran a husky camp on the town's outskirts, froze the first time he saw it, as if it awakened something buried deep in memory. That day, his voice was low, steady. This boy is like no other. He's the bridge. Rachel didn't fully understand what he meant. All she knew was that the first time Liam met Shadow, a silent, coal-black pup who didn't bark or wag, he needed no prompting. No one taught him how to approach. No one encouraged him. He simply walked up, placed his hand on the mesh, and stood still, waiting as if the creature would recognize something in him. And Shadow didn't bark, didn't leap. He stepped forward and gently touched his nose to the boy's hand. Frank had witnessed hundreds of pairings between huskies and children, but never had he seen a gaze like that, a silent tether between two souls who had never met before. Since the day Shadow came to live with them, everything began to change. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small, vital shifts. Liam began to whisper to Shadow. No one knew what he said, but he spoke. Then came short phrases, then full sentences. He began to draw pictures, not of people, but of a black wolf beside a boy under a starlit sky. For the first time in months, Rachel heard laughter. For the first time, she saw her son fall asleep, arms wrapped around another being, peaceful like children everywhere. But not everyone saw this as a miracle. Neighbors began to murmur, to question. That's no dog. She lets her kid sleep with a wolf? Look at its eyes. It's not a normal pet. And the whispers didn't stop in Pine Grove. They spread further. Outside the town, in windowless rooms, scientists tracked Shadow's existence. They didn't care about love or the magical bond between a neurodivergent boy and a wild creature. They saw genes they had hunted for decades. Shadow's genes. And they began uttering a name in secret meetings. Bridge code. And Liam Carter, with the paw print etched into his wrist, was the final piece they needed. No one knew that behind the rebirth of a child, something ancient was stirring. At the center of the coming storm, a boy and a wolf stood side by side. No words, no promises, bound only by a truth no one else could divide. As whispers in town grew louder and the wary stares of neighbors turned into open avoidance, Rachel knew she had to do something. Not just to shield Liam from prejudice, but to search for real hope. A kind of connection that therapy and medication had never been able to provide. That's why, on a dull gray autumn afternoon, she took a chance. She drove with her son deep into the outskirts of Pine Grove, down a winding dirt road past withered woods, to a place most people barely spoke of. Frank Weston's husky camp, home of the reclusive man locals called the Wolf Whisperer. Frank opened the gate with an old wooden cane, his steel-gray eyes sharp and still as a winter lake, drilling into the pair without a single blink. He offered no greeting, only a glance toward Rachel before letting his gaze settle on Liam, the boy clutching tightly to his mother's sleeve, eyes downcast but feet unmoving. There was no need for explanations, no need for medical records. Frank gave a slight nod, gestured for them to follow, and led them past rows of chain-link kennels where huskies barked, raced, tugged at leashes, and clawed at metal doors. But Liam didn't flinch. He moved past them all, as if searching for something beyond what sound or sight could offer. At the end of the row, Frank stopped at a quiet, shadowed corner. He pointed. "One left. He's not like the others." Inside the kennel stood a jet-black pup, its coat gleaming like coal, its amber eyes burning like torches in the dark. It didn't bark, didn't pace, didn't wag its tail. It simply stood there and looked. Not with curiosity, but with the gaze of something ancient, something that had seen too much and was waiting to be seen. Then, without a word, Liam let go of his mother's hand and stepped forward. No one spoke. Rachel held her breath. The boy approached the cage and reached out his tiny hand to touch the cold wire mesh. To everyone's astonishment, the pup moved too, placing its nose precisely where the boy's palm met the fence. No barking, no noise. Just two souls finding each other in absolute silence, where language had no place. Frank stood frozen, staring at the scene as if it had turned him to stone. Then, suddenly, he turned to Rachel. His eyes dropped to Liam's left wrist, exposed now as the wind lifted his sleeve. Where the birthmark lay, the perfect imprint of a wolf paw. Frank's expression shifted, equal parts confusion and awe. He stepped back slightly as though in the presence of something sacred. His voice came low, almost reverent. "The wolf has found its own." Rachel didn't understand the full meaning of his words, but a shiver ran down her spine. Not from fear, but from the unmistakable sense that something in the air had changed. An invisible wave had passed through the space between human and beast, something deeper than science, deeper than genetics, deeper than the murmurs of those hiding in the shadows. Far from there, inside a hidden underground facility posing as a genetics research institute, electronic sensors picked up Shadow's movement. Shadow, the creature presumed lost a decade ago after vanishing from a classified project. Files marked top secret, strings of DNA codes, and old dust-covered dossiers were pulled from archives. In that cold, dim room, a new name was entered into the system's tracking log: Liam Carter. At that moment, it wasn't just one person who noticed the boy touching something extraordinary. Genex, the covert organization once shut down for unethical experiments on animals and children, was awakening again. This time, not to study. This time, to seize. While Liam and Shadow stood facing one another as if they'd waited their whole lives for that moment, fate was already shifting far beyond their view. And from that point on, there would be no turning back. The change began as softly as a breeze whispering through the forest. No warning, no noise, but enough to stir something deep within Rachel's weary soul, something long dormant. After 6 long years of waiting, she finally saw it, a real smile on her son's face. From the moment Shadow crossed the threshold of their small home on the outskirts of Pine Grove, the atmosphere inside shifted. The air seemed gentler, the light warmer, and the heavy silences that had once stretched for hours were slowly replaced by quiet, wondrous sounds. Liam's footsteps echoing down the hallway, his hushed voice murmuring to Shadow late at night, his soft giggle as he played a game only the two of them understood, hiding behind curtains before surprising his companion with a playful tap on the shoulder. Rachel no longer had to read her son's emotions through frozen expressions or abstract, scribbled drawings. Now, Liam began to express himself, first in whispers, then full sentences. "Shadow's hungry," or "Let's draw the forest today, Mom." One morning, Rachel walked into his room to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor, leaning against Shadow's side, coloring a vivid picture, a small boy in the middle of a night forest beside a large black wolf gazing at the moon. Above them, stars connected by tiny red threads shimmered in the sky. Liam looked up and smiled. "That's me and him. I dreamed we were flying." Rachel nearly broke down in tears. He wasn't just speaking. He was dreaming. He wasn't just alive. He was truly living for the first time. But beneath the wonder, something else was quietly unfolding. When Shadow first arrived, he was barely larger than a young husky. Yet within 2 months, he had grown to nearly match Liam in height, his weight far exceeding normal limits. And it wasn't just his size. Shadow's behavior defied explanation. He never needed training, never damaged furniture, and somehow knew how to open doors, draw the blinds, or retrieve keys when Rachel dropped them. He didn't bark or whimper, but each time Liam entered a room, he let out a deep, resonant hum, a greeting that felt intentional. More curious still, Rachel once saw Liam make a gesture in the air, and Shadow responded instantly, sitting, lying down, or turning toward the window. No one had taught the boy. No one had trained the wolf. Rachel began documenting everything. She filmed Shadow's daily behavior, sending clips to Dr. Mason, her longtime friend, and an animal behavior specialist. After watching footage of Shadow precisely opening a cage with his teeth or calmly stepping in front of an aggressive dog in the park and stopping it cold with a single stare, Mason simply replied, "I don't know what that is, but if it's a dog, it's the next step in evolution." Rachel's awe soon gave way to unease. Not fear. She never once felt afraid of Shadow, but a gnawing concern at the intelligence and something else, something human in him. One day, a stray dog wandered into the backyard. Shadow didn't bark or charge. He stood upright, muscles taut, eyes locked, not hostile but unmistakably warning. The moment Liam ran out and touched his side, Shadow immediately relaxed, lowering himself to the ground, his entire stance melting into calm. Rachel witnessed it and felt a chill run through her. This was not a typical dog. It is understood more than reflex. It had reason. And while Rachel wrestled with her theories, hundreds of miles away, the name Shadow lit up again on GenX's classified data network. GenX, the genetic research program long shut down for unethical experiments involving hybrid animals and children. In a dark room filled with screens, files, and blinking code, a geneticist stared at a recovered DNA profile. 87% northwestern gray wolf, 9% Siberian husky, and a small segment marked unknown, a genetic structure not found in any known database. It didn't take long to trace the trail. A veterinary report leak, satellite footage of Pine Grove. Suddenly, the names Rachel Carter and Liam Carter were flagged. In an internal memo, they wrote, "Subject S7 has re-established connection. The child exhibits traits consistent with bridge classification. Behavioral and psychocellular response levels exceed projection. Activate level 2. Retrieved the specimen. Locate the child. Priority? Media silence." While Rachel fought to protect the fragile and beautiful bond between her son and Shadow, the first true hope she'd held in 6 years, the shadows of the past were gathering. Secrets buried in Shadow's origin, and the cold machinery of an organization that believed in neither emotion nor humanity began closing in. Something had awakened. And this time, it wasn't only after Shadow. It had its eyes on a little boy who carried within him something they could never replicate, an invisible thread that could awaken truths science had never dared to imagine. When Shadow started appearing alongside Liam in the Central Park, on the front porch in the late afternoons, or during their morning walks near the edges of Pine Grove, the fragile peace Rachel had worked so hard to protect for her son began to waver under the weight of staring eyes and the rising murmur of voices in their tight-knit town. In a place where everyone knew each other's names, where gossip moved faster than the mountain wind, nothing seemed more unsettling than the image of a quiet boy, diagnosed with severe autism, forming an unbreakable bond with a towering, black-furred creature whose wild, golden gaze unsettled even the bravest hearts. What unnerved the townsfolk most was the creature's silence. It didn't bark, growl, or wag its tail like an ordinary dog. It simply observed, still and watchful, like an unseen sentinel. "Rachel Carter's keeping a wolf in her house. I'm telling you, it's bigger than a husky. Pitch black fur, eyes like fire. And that kid, he's not normal. Who knows what could happen if that thing snaps?" Somebody needs to call the police, or at least animal control. What started as whispers over fruit stands and coffee counters soon grew into something heavier, a collective unease. A concerned group of residents, led by Henry Weller, a hardened war veteran who had survived 2 wars and didn't trust anything he couldn't control, called an emergency meeting with the town sheriff. He came armed with grainy photos of Shadow behind a fence, printed out reports of wolf attacks from other states, and a firm warning: that animal is not a domestic pet. Sheriff David Monroe, though unconvinced there was cause to intervene, felt the pressure mounting and reluctantly promised to look into the situation. But Henry Weller didn't wait. A week later, he and 2 longtime neighbors, both amateur hunters, entered the woods behind Rachel's home, rifles in hand, determined to eliminate what they saw as a threat before anything happened. It was a bitterly cold morning. Snow blanketed the earth like a thick sheet, and the pine trees stood still in the misty dawn. Rachel had just seen Liam off through the back door for his morning walk with Shadow, a new routine that brought him rare, grounding calm. She hadn't even begun breakfast when a sudden, explosive crack split the air. A gunshot. The second shot followed like a blade through her chest. Rachel bolted outside, slipping on the frozen ground, her heart racing as she spotted her son standing frozen at the forest's edge. Not far from him, 3 men with rifles stood locked in position, aiming straight at Shadow. The creature stood still between the trees, motionless like stone. It didn't snarl. It didn't flee. It simply stared, golden eyes unwavering, into the barrels pointed at its heart. Without hesitation, Liam stepped forward, arms outstretched, placing himself between Shadow and the rifles. There was no fear in his face, only a quiet certainty that made the men falter. He looked up, and his voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the cold. "Don't touch him. He's my friend. He's mine." And then, the impossible happened. Shadow, the creature that had stirred such fear with nothing more than his presence, slowly lowered his head, his ears tilted back. Without a sound, he walked calmly to Liam's side and gently pressed his nose into the boy's outstretched palm, as if declaring in a single gesture, "I belong here." Of the 3 hunters, the youngest was the first to lower his gun. "The kid controls it," he muttered, then took a step back. The others hesitated, but when Rachel appeared, running, tears streaking down her face as she threw her arms around Liam and shouted in a flood of panic and gratitude, they lowered their weapons and backed away in silence. That day, Rachel understood something she hadn't dared name until then. What existed between Liam and Shadow wasn't just attachment, and it went beyond any relationship between human and animal. It was a harmony older than memory, buried in earth, in blood, in ancient instincts beyond human comprehension. And now, for the first time in living memory, it had awakened in the form of a boy the world had cast aside, and a creature it called a threat. At that very moment, deep underground, in a windowless room lit only by data screens, a raspy voice came through Genix's internal radio line. "Shadow has responded. So has the child. Phase 1 is complete. Proceed to direct surveillance." And from the shadows, the watchers, those who had never taken their eyes off Liam, took one step closer. No longer distant observers, but hands made of calculation and cold steel, ready to move. In the days following the incident in the woods, when Liam had stood like a living shield between Shadow and 3 raised rifles, Rachel couldn't shake the unease curling its way through every corner of her mind. There had been no injuries, no official action. Sheriff Monroe had spoken publicly to calm the town, assuring them the situation was under control. But the doubt in her neighbor's eyes, the anonymous notes stuffed into her mailbox, and the strange stillness in Shadow's gaze every time it met hers, all of it whispered one thing: the truth was no longer something she could afford to ignore. She needed answers, not just to protect her son, but to understand the creature that now slept beneath Liam's bed each night. So she drove 3 hours through winding mountain roads to the animal genetics lab of an old friend, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned geneticist now working at the University of Montana. Elena had spent years studying hybrid wildlife, and the moment she laid eyes on Shadow, she fell completely silent. The creature stood motionless in the clinic. No growls, no whimpers, just stillness. And those eyes Elena would later describe as not belonging to any domesticated world, made her hesitate before reaching out. Rachel didn't offer explanations. She only said, "I need to know what he is." The examination lasted the entire morning. Elena collected blood, fur, and saliva samples, working with quiet intensity as she occasionally scribbled in her notebook, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. Rachel sat silently nearby, her anxiety sharpening as Elena dimmed the lights, activated the gene sequencer, and finally exhaled in a slow, measured breath, as if each breath had to be calculated before she could speak. A week later, Rachel returned for the results. Elena placed a thick file on the table. She didn't need to open it to know the truth. Waiting inside wasn't ordinary. "Elena," Rachel said softly, "just say it." "I can take it." Elena removed her glasses. Her voice was steady but tightly held back. "Rachel, Shadow isn't a normal dog. According to the full genome sequencing, he's approximately 87% Northwestern Gray Wolf, 9% Siberian Husky, and the remaining percentage is a hybrid sequence we've never seen in any scientific record." She paused. "He's not just a Wolfdog mix. He's what I would call a high-content hybrid. Or, more accurately, a genetically engineered entity, designed for a specific purpose." The room went still. Rachel could hear her heartbeat. "So is he legal?" she asked, her voice rough with fear. "In Montana, owning a hybrid with over 50% wolf DNA is legal, but only with registration and strict safety compliance, with this level of genetic content." Elena hesitated. "Shadow qualifies as a high-content hybrid. If discovered, you could be forced to turn him over to wildlife authorities." Rachel sat frozen. She didn't know whether to be more afraid for her son or Shadow. Because once those papers became public, Shadow would no longer be seen as a companion or family. He would become a security risk, subject to control, confinement, or worse. Elena reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Rachel's. Her eyes held something deeper than scientific concern. They held fear. "There's something else I didn't put in the report. I found a unique genetic marker, a strand that doesn't appear in any natural genome. It's not random, it was designed. And if I'm right, someone made him." Hundreds of miles away, in the underground bunker of Genix, alarms blared softly across the internal surveillance network. The genetic match had been made. DNA from the Montana lab had been successfully cross-referenced with Project S7, a failed program officially declared terminated 10 years ago. A team was mobilized. But they weren't just armed with Shadow's file. They had also retrieved the medical profile of Liam Carter, the boy with a wolf paw birthmark on his wrist. The child suspected of forming a neurocellular resonance with the hybrid, a phenomenon previously thought to be theoretical. And so, while Rachel sat still at the lab, her hands heavy with a report she hadn't yet closed, and Liam remained at home drawing strange, beautiful pictures of himself and Shadow flying through starlit skies, silent footsteps were moving closer. Not just curious observers anymore, but real hands, cold and deliberate, carrying a truth science had never touched and a threat no one dared speak aloud. Because Shadow wasn't just created. He was the key. And Liam was the one who had awakened something ancient, something powerful, something that refused to be forgotten. When Rachel left Elena's lab, the sealed folder heavy in her hands, her heart carried a weight no mother should ever have to bear. The choice between obeying the law and protecting the one creature that had pulled her son back from the shadows. As she drove back toward Pine Grove, the wind slammed against the car windows like a warning of what was coming. Calls from wildlife control, cold glances from neighbors, and worst of all, an official notice from the Montana Division of Special Species Management. Shadow, with a hybrid genome exceeding 80%, was legally required to be transferred to Wild Haven, a high-security sanctuary in the north, reserved for genetically complex and behaviorally unpredictable animals. Rachel had stared at that letter for hours, every word sinking like nails into her chest. No one had asked how that creature had saved her son. No one cared about the bond she witnessed every day. They only saw the number, 87% wolf. They didn't see the afternoons Liam spent sketching beside Shadow, or hear the sound of his laughter breaking 6 years of silence. They didn't understand that this animal wasn't just a companion. He was a part of Liam's soul, as vital as blood, as real as breath. But Rachel knew the law, and she knew if she refused, they would come. They would force her hand, and things would only get worse. So, in the hope of preserving what little control she had left, she made the only choice she could, to take Shadow to safety herself. She placed her fragile trust in Wild Haven, a wildlife sanctuary known for its ethical practices, the same place she'd once sent injured owls for rehabilitation. But this time, it wasn't an owl. It was Shadow. That morning she woke Liam earlier than usual. He sat up slowly under his blanket, tousled hair and sleepy eyes following her movements in silence. Shadow was already by the window, where the first sliver of morning light reached through the distant pine trees. Rachel knelt beside her son, brushing the hair from his forehead, and spoke as steadily as she could. "Liam, today we need to take Shadow somewhere else. There will be special people there to care for him, because he's a very special being." Liam didn't speak. He looked straight into her eyes, deep and steady, older than his years. Then, as if he had always known, he turned and wrapped his arms tightly around Shadow's neck. Rachel had to look away when she saw his small hand gripping the thick black fur, like he never wanted to let go. During the long drive to Wild Haven, Liam said nothing. He held his worn sketchbook tightly in his lap, each page filled with drawings of him and Shadow, climbing mountains, flying through night skies, standing together in the rain. As the car slowed before the tall wooden gates of the sanctuary nestled deep in the forest, Rachel felt as if she were delivering her son's entire world into a place she wasn't sure she could ever take back from. Margaret Ellis, the director of Wild Haven, was waiting with 2 staff members. A seasoned woman with a stern face, softened by remarkably kind eyes. She paused when she saw Liam step out of the car, hand in paw with Shadow. Something in the way the creature walked beside the boy, slow, proud, but gentle, made Margaret's chest tighten. At the moment of farewell, Liam knelt, hugging Shadow tightly before pulling a simple leather cord from his backpack. He looped it into a makeshift collar and fastened it gently around the wolf's neck. His hands trembled as he whispered, voice breaking. You promised we'd never be apart!" Rachel tried to hold back the sob, but couldn't. She dropped to her knees, holding her son and the wolf together, feeling the shared breath between the two, one human, one creature, trembling in perfect unison. When the gates of Wild Haven closed behind Shadow, Rachel turned away, unable to look back, and Liam, for the first time in months, returned to silence. He didn't speak. He didn't draw. He didn't sleep. He simply stood by the window all night, clutching a blank sketchbook, eyes staring at a sky that no longer felt like his. Somewhere deep in the northern woods, Shadow curled into himself inside a high-security enclosure. He didn't eat. He didn't move. He only watched the empty road where Liam had disappeared. The staff at Wild Haven called it separation trauma. But Margaret knew better. This wasn't instinct. This was grief, the collapse of a bond that had existed beyond biology. Meanwhile, in a surveillance room beneath the Genex facility, the secret GPS tag attached to Rachel's car finally paid off. The signal led them to Wild Haven. A man in a white lab coat picked up the file stamped in bold red, Bridge subject confirmed. Phase 2, recovery protocol authorized. The goodbye was only the beginning. What came next would be far crueler than loss. The moment the heavy wooden gates of Wild Haven closed behind Shadow, something inside the fragile world Rachel and Liam had carefully rebuilt began to silently collapse. Rachel tried to comfort her son with gentle words, telling him that Shadow would be well cared for, that one day they would be reunited. But the emptiness in Liam's eyes said more than words ever could. His heart had been taken from him, and nothing could replace it. At Wildhaven, Shadow was placed in a quiet isolation enclosure deep within a thick pine forest, far from other animals. A rotating team of specialists tended to him, cleaning his space and offering carefully prepared meals with precise nutritional calculations. But day after day, Shadow refused to eat. He simply lay curled in the corner, his body still, his amber eyes dulled beneath a weight of sorrow. Every time soft footsteps approached, he lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the gate, only to lower them again in quiet disappointment. Margaret Ellis, who had witnessed hundreds of cases involving displaced wildlife, admitted this was different. This wasn't biology. This was grief. A creature with a heart torn apart by separation from the boy who had once touched its soul. Back in Pine Grove, Liam returned like an empty shell. The vibrant drawings that once filled his sketchbook had turned to gray scribbles. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. At night, Rachel sat silently beside his bed, sometimes hearing him whisper in his sleep, "Wait for me, Shadow. I'm coming." One night she found him at the window, clutching the old leather cord that had once circled Shadow's neck, staring into the dark woods as if trying to send a message no one else could hear. Rachel, once a skilled veterinarian who had saved hundreds of animals, now found herself powerless before the silent collapse of her child. She cooked his favorite meals, brought in therapists, played music from better days. But nothing pierced the invisible wall Liam had rebuilt. The very wall she had once celebrated seeing crumble now stood taller and colder than ever. One rainy afternoon, drained and defeated, Rachel sat alone in her empty clinic, head resting on the desk in exhaustion. A soft knock broke the silence. At first she thought it was a dream, but when she looked up, standing in the doorway, in his old weathered cowboy hat, those steel-gray eyes that saw through everything, was Frank Weston. He didn't say much. He simply stepped inside, placed a worn leather satchel on the table, and pulled out a stack of crumpled papers, old files, and a hand-drawn map. Rachel stared in confusion as Frank gave a slow, deliberate nod. "There are things you need to know. About Shadow, about Liam, and about the thing they're calling the bridge." "Them?" Rachel's voice was tight with dread. Frank looked toward the window, his voice dropping low. "Genix. They never stopped. And now they've found him." He paused, letting the silence settle like dust before continuing. "Liam isn't just a child with autism. He's one of the rare few who carry a genetic imprint compatible with hybrid wolf blood. And Shadow, he didn't find your boy by accident. They're what's called a bridge pair, born to link two worlds, the human and the wild." Rachel clenched her fists, unsure whether it was fear or rage pulsing through her. But one look into Frank's unwavering gaze told her what she needed to know. There was no time left for doubt. Liam was fading by the day. Shadow was waiting until his heart could no longer endure the silence. And Genix, relentless and precise, was moving closer with every passing hour. At that moment, Rachel understood. There was only one path left if she wanted to save them both. She had to bring Liam back to Shadow, no matter the cost. Rachel sat in the small back room of her clinic, a place once filled with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the clinking of metal tools. Now, it held a silence heavier than any surgery she had ever performed. In front of her, Frank Weston unfurled a faded, time-worn map, his finger tracing lines marked in red ink. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm building beneath. After years of silence, he was finally ready to speak the truth Rachel should have known the moment Shadow entered her son's life. No more hesitation, no more secrets. Frank admitted what no one else dared say. Shadow was not a natural creature. He was the result of a secret experiment known as Project Bridge Wolf. Years ago, he explained, a team of geneticists and behavioral scientists under Genix had chased a reckless dream: to create beings that combined the intelligence and primal instincts of wolves with the empathy and emotional attachment of domestic dogs. The goal had not been to make monsters, but to engineer biological bridges, creatures capable of forming mental and emotional bonds with humans, specifically with those who possessed a rare neural mutation, children like Liam. Frank had once been part of a small internal resistance, a faction within Genix that opposed turning these hybrids into lab tools. They called themselves the Wardens of the Line, Guardians of the Bloodline. Shadow, labeled as Subject S7, was one of the few bridge wolves they had managed to rescue when the project was exposed and forcibly shut down. "We thought we'd erased every trace," Frank said, his voice low with regret. "But we were wrong. Shadow was injured during the escape. We hid him at my husky camp, waiting for a chance. I never imagined he would find the one child his DNA could resonate with. A true bridge child." Rachel felt the strength drain from her. All the scattered pieces in her mind suddenly locked into place. The strange wolf paw birthmark on Liam's wrist, the silent communication between her son and Shadow, the dreams, the drawings, the shared understanding that defied language. None of it was coincidence. Liam had been born with a rare genetic anomaly that allowed his brain and nervous system to respond to the emotional signals of creatures with the bridge wolf genome. It wasn't just healing, it was mutual recognition. Two souls aligned at the deepest level of instinct and memory. And that, Frank warned, was why Genix would never stop. They didn't just want Shadow, they wanted Liam, a child capable of unlocking the full potential of the bridge wolves, a living key to resurrecting the project. Frank's voice grew darker, his words sharp and deliberate. "They will come, and this time they're not coming to study, they're coming to take." At that moment, Rachel understood. Leaving Shadow in isolation and letting Liam wither in silence was never really a choice. It was a trap. Genix was waiting for the pair to weaken, to make them easier to control. The only way to save both, and perhaps to protect others like Liam, was to reunite the bridge pair. To expose the truth about the bridge wolves, not in the cold detachment of a lab report, but through the undeniable reality of their bond. Their memory, their connection, their hearts. Rachel looked up, her eyes no longer weary, but burning with resolve. "Then we take Liam to Wild Haven," she said, "before they get to him." Frank nodded, folding the map with careful hands, as if the line he once swore to protect had finally come alive again. Not in theory, but in the form of a boy and a black wolf. "The bridge," he whispered, "is finally being called by its true name." After Frank left, leaving behind truths that pierced through Rachel's beliefs like blades peeling away layers of old certainties, she realized that science alone would never be enough to explain what was happening. Whatever bond existed between Liam and Shadow had long since crossed the boundary of biology and behavior. It was no longer about cells, DNA, or therapy. It was something deeper, something ancient, a connection even Frank had only brushed the surface of. And Rachel knew there was only one person who might truly understand: Joseph Greyfeather, the elder of the native community that had lived in quiet seclusion on the northern edge of Pine Grove for generations. His people carried stories the way forests carried breath, passed down through whispers, remembered through silence. She found him on a gray afternoon when the sun was buried beneath thick clouds like an old blanket. Joseph, with his long silver hair, canyon-deep eyes, and a voice low and steady as wind through stone, greeted her with a calmness that made her wonder if he had expected her all along. Rachel didn't need to say much. She gently turned her son's wrist upward, revealing the birthmark, a perfect wolf paw print. The same mark she had touched countless times, torn between awe and sorrow. Joseph looked at it, not with surprise or confusion, but with a quiet recognition, like he was seeing something from an old dream returned to life. "You call it a mutation," Joseph said, his voice dissolving into the rustle of leaves outside. "But we call it the wolf's embrace. It doesn't appear by accident. It's a calling, from the ancestors, from the sleeping woods, granting a child the right to hear what others cannot, to see what others will never see." Rachel's lips parted as if to question, to challenge, but she couldn't, because she had seen it, with her own eyes. Liam spoke to Shadow without a word. Two beings, human and beast, touching like notes in harmony. She knew then. Science could explain part of it, but the rest required belief. Joseph told her the legend of the children marked by the wolf, what modern minds might call bridge children, but to his people were known as those who hear the forest. The story spoke of ancient wolves who, once in every generation, would choose a child to walk beside, not as master and pet, but as two halves of a greater soul. They would live together, hurt together, heal together. The mark was the red thread that tied two worlds, human and wild, matter and spirit. And once the bond was formed, breaking it would cause pain, not symbolic, but real. It would harm them both. "That's why your son is fading, and the creature won't eat," Joseph said, his eyes meeting Rachel's with unflinching calm. "They don't just miss each other, they're dying. Breath by breath, dream by dream." Rachel stifled a sob, her chest tightening with something beyond fear. Not just the fear of losing her son, but of losing something sacred, taking root between two souls the world had never tried to understand. Joseph placed a hand gently on her shoulder, then opened an old wooden box on the table. Inside lay a string of black stone beads, strung on deerskin, with a single carved centerpiece, a wolf paw, identical to the mark on Liam's wrist. "This is our totem," he whispered. "If you still doubt, place it on your son. If the bond is true, the stone will warm." Rachel reached out, her hand trembling, and closed her fingers around the totem. Each carved line, each cold ridge seemed to pulse with silence, until suddenly a faint warmth stirred from its center, like a weak heartbeat. Joseph smiled gently. "You don't have to believe in legends," he said, "but if you want to save your son, and save Shadow, you must believe in the bond they chose." Outside, the moss-covered cabin stood quiet beneath the first falling leaves of autumn. The pine grove forest exhaled a long breath, like a prophecy rustling through the trees. And from within the wind, Rachel thought she heard it, the distant, aching howl of a lone wolf, not broken, but enduring, calling something home, something awakening. When Rachel left Joseph Greyfeather's moss-covered cabin, she carried more than just the bead necklace that had begun to warm in her hand. She carried a new conviction. It was no longer vague, no longer clouded by doubt. It was a deep, unwavering understanding. What was happening between Liam and Shadow could never be fully explained by data or diagnostics. It was something alive, something flowing through blood and breath, the heartbeat of two beings born to find each other. And if she waited even one more day, if she didn't reunite them, it wouldn't just be the loss of an extraordinary creature. Her son, the boy who had once smiled and spoken his first words because of that creature, would vanish again into a silence no one could reach. With Frank's help and a formal endorsement from Joseph himself, Rachel contacted Wildhaven and arranged to speak directly with Margaret Ellis. At first, Margaret hesitated. Never before had a child been allowed near the isolation zone, especially one housing a creature like Shadow, now classified as exhibiting severe psychological distress post-separation. But when Frank presented classified documents detailing Shadow's origins and explained Liam's rare neurological resonance with the hybrid species, Margaret's skepticism gave way to something else, especially when she saw the photograph of Liam kneeling by the gate the day they parted, still clutching the leather collar in his small hand. "We'll allow it," Margaret said at last, voice soft but resolute, "under strict supervision, and for no more than 10 minutes a day, at least to start. Rachel needed nothing more. The next morning, she brought Liam back to Wild Haven. The air was still, each breeze humming with anticipation. Liam said nothing during the drive, his sketchbook and the old collar tucked tightly in his arms. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a light Rachel hadn't seen in weeks. The light of hope. Shadow lay curled beneath an old pine tree, his once glossy black coat now dulled, his frame smaller, sunken. When the sanctuary staff opened the metal gate leading to the observation area, Liam stepped forward, no sound, no rush, and simply whispered, "Shadow." And in that instant, the miracle unfolded. No command was needed, no leash, no coaxing. That single word, spoken like a heartbeat coming back to life, made Shadow stir. His ears perked, his eyes dimmed by days of waiting, flared wide, and in one swift motion he rose, sprinting to the edge of the enclosure, stopping just behind the mesh fence. His eyes locked with Liam's, overflowing with something no language could contain. Liam didn't cry, didn't shout. He simply placed his hand against the wire, right where Shadow pressed his forehead, the wolf's hot breath filtering through, warming the boy's fingers. Two souls, once torn apart, stitched whole again by a single silent touch. Behind them, Margaret covered her mouth, tears rising in her eyes. She turned to Rachel, voice trembling. "No one can train an animal to respond like that. This isn't obedience. This is connection." In the days that followed, Liam was granted special status, the youngest volunteer in Wild Haven's history. Under close supervision, and with Rachel always present, he visited every day. He brought his sketchbook, sat for hours beside Shadow's enclosure, drawing, writing symbols, and using a hand sign language he'd crafted himself. The most astonishing part? Shadow understood it all. When Liam circled his finger, Shadow sat. When he tapped 3 times, Shadow lay down. When he slowly lifted his hand skyward, the wolf raised its head in unison, as if listening to the wind with him. At first, the staff believed it coincidence, until Liam performed a complex sequence of 4 gestures, and Shadow followed each move precisely, flawlessly, without delay. Awe replaced doubt. Dr. Logan Pierce, Wild Haven's behavioral biologist, began filming every interaction. After one session, reviewing the footage, he could barely speak. "We're witnessing an unprecedented level of interspecies communication," he whispered. "This isn't command. It's conversation." Outside the enclosure, Rachel stood silently, watching her son laugh for the first time in weeks. His hand moved across the page, sketching stars, red threads, and a path winding through a deep forest. She understood now. This wasn't just a reunion between a boy and his companion. This was the beginning of something far greater, a place where life, science, and spirit met in perfect harmony. A forgotten truth was being reborn, the truth of a friendship that transcended species. From the very moment Liam and Shadow were reunited, the experts at Wild Haven knew they were witnessing something that reached far beyond behavioral familiarity or reunion joy. This wasn't simply a well-trained animal responding to an old companion. It was something deeper, subtle, yet undeniable. In the recorded footage, the pair moved as if sharing a single mind. Liam would raise a hand, and Shadow would respond without hesitation. When Liam sat in silence for hours, Shadow would sit beside him just as still, never looking away, alert to his every movement. It was as if they shared the same thought patterns. These phenomena led Dr. Logan Pierce, Wild Haven's behavioral biologist, to propose a theory more radical than any he had dared to consider before. Could there exist a linking gene? A genetic bridge between human and wolf? With Rachel's cautious approval, Logan reopened Liam's old medical files from the day of his birth at Pine Grove Hospital through early blood tests and even DNA data collected during his autism diagnosis. Cross-referencing it with Shadow's existing samples, Logan dove deep into genomic layers rarely explored in routine testing. segments so rare they were often dismissed as statistical anomalies or too complex to decode. Then, on a dreary afternoon, while rain whispered against the lab windows, a soft ping echoed from the lab's console. A data match. Logan stared at the screen, frozen. A perfect match. Not just in sequence location, but in actual code, an identical genetic structure, previously undocumented in any known database of human or animal genomes. He named it the bridge gene. This rare gene sequence lay hidden in coding regions associated with emotional perception, nonverbal communication, and, most remarkably, it lit up when another life form carrying the same genetic pattern was present. In this case, Liam and Shadow were two separate species sharing a genetic frequency, something believed biologically impossible unless triggered by one of two factors: a miraculous evolutionary coincidence or a highly specific, generational genetic intervention. Logan immediately called Rachel into the lab. Displayed on the screen were two sequences, Liam's and Shadow's, glowing like mirrored constellations, their bright intersections perfectly aligned. Logan pointed to the core connection. "This is the bridge gene," he said. "The source of their resonance, a sequence that doesn't belong strictly to humans or wolves, but binds both. We thought it was emotional, maybe even mystical, but it's biology. It's in their blood." Rachel sat in stunned silence. She had once believed, like any woman of science, that everything could be explained by method, evidence, and probability. But what she saw now was no longer just a child with autism, just a genetically enhanced animal. It was two beings shaped by something deeper, a shared legacy etched into their DNA. It wasn't luck. It was genetic destiny. Margaret Ellis entered quietly. She had seen hundreds of transformations at Wildhaven, broken creatures rediscovering instinct, injured animals regaining spirit. But this was different. She didn't need to see charts or grasp complex scientific terms. She spoke softly. "Maybe our ancestors knew this long before us. They called it the call of the forest. You call it a gene." While the room absorbed the magnitude of what had just been confirmed, a red alert suddenly flashed on one of the sanctuary's biosurveillance monitors, a system usually used for animal health tracking and environmental alerts. But this was no routine signal. Logan's brows furrowed as he read the message on the screen. Bridge gene identified. Subject, Liam Carter. Match rate, 100%. Data forwarded to Central Registry. Potential breach detected. The room suddenly turned cold. Rachel clenched her fists. There was no more doubt. Genix had discovered the truth. And when they came, they wouldn't bring a research proposal. They'd bring a recall order. Liam wasn't just a special child anymore. He had become a target. At the same time, in the private pen, Shadow lifted its head, ears swiveling with the wind as if hearing something from far away, an invisible sound no one else could hear except for it. And in the empty living room behind the clinic, Liam was drawing. No more stars, no more red threads. He was drawing a road with two creatures running side by side, a boy and a wolf. At the end of the road was a cliff, and beyond the cliff was the sky. But this time the sky wasn't blue, it was red, like a prophecy no one taught, but the child could feel, in his blood, in the deepest part of his genes. At the same time that Logan detected traces of tracking within the system, right as the classified genetic data on the bridge gene was confirmed and unintentionally transmitted, something else was stirring hundreds of miles away from Wildhaven. Deep beneath the Nevada desert, in an underground facility hidden from the world, Genix was awakening from a slumber that had lasted more than a decade. This was a place with no nameplate, no public records, and no witnesses beyond those who had been part of it, an inhuman genetic project dismantled by the government for exceeding the ethical boundaries of science. But Genix had never truly disappeared. It had merely retreated, lying in wait, re-emerging under the guise of an independent institute for evolutionary biology. funded by private corporations where ambition and greed outweighed morality. And now, as the signal flashed, Bridge gene, 100% match. Originating from Wildhaven, they knew the final piece had surfaced. Not just another hybrid like Shadow, a rare specimen with wolf DNA, but something far more significant. A human carrying the pure Bridge gene. A child named Liam Carter. In the dimly lit operations room, surrounded by monitoring screens, Dr. Marion Vall, the leader of the New Generation Genix project, stared intently at the freshly received genetic analysis. Her silver hair gleamed under the faint glow, her steel-cold eyes narrowing as the images of Shadow and Liam appeared side by side in the comparison file. At last, "The bridge has awakened," she murmured, her voice like an ancient incantation coming to life. Beside her stood Ethan Rourke, head of specialized biological retrieval, a man trained not just to hunt, but to erase every trace of his targets once secured. He glanced at the file, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need both of them?" "Not just need," Marion replied, eyes fixed on the screen. "They are the key to restarting Project Alpha Genesis, the plan to create bioresonant superorganisms with humans." Under the banner of research, Genix had once engineered countless hybrid creatures, but their greatest failure was the lack of a resonant counterpart. The creations became unstable, attacking indiscriminately, starving themselves, or going mad from isolation. Too late, they realized. For a transcendent organism to survive and evolve, it required a human, not as a master, but as a spiritual link. Now, Liam and Shadow were the first perfect pair, the living proof of Genix's entire theory. If they could capture them, Genix could replicate the process, using the Bridge gene as the foundation for an entire generation of resonant beings. Biological superorganisms controlled through pure mental synchronization, no chips, no drugs required. "Priority: alive," Marion stated coldly. "But if the child resists, extract the bone marrow before he dies." Ethan nodded, signaling the specialized retrieval team, light armor, biotracking devices, and high-grade tranquilizers. No noise, no disruption. All they needed was one night and 2 living subjects. Meanwhile, in Wildhaven, Rachel jolted awake in the dead of night, a strange unease washing over her, as if something was stirring beyond the forest. Liam was still sound asleep, arms wrapped around his sketchbook. In the distance, inside the isolated enclosure, Shadow let out a low, eerie growl. No one heard it, except Liam. His eyes flickered open, staring straight at the pitch-black window. And somehow, as if sensing an invisible force tightening around him, he whispered, "They're coming!" From deep within, not through words, but something older than language itself, he felt the tether between him and Shadow being pulled taut, stretched to its breaking point. As the night wind wove through the dense pines of Wildhaven, carrying a biting chill and an unshakable sense of unease, Rachel found herself unable to sleep. The looming threat of Genix hung over her like a thick fog, and the instincts of a mother made every fiber of her being tense like a drawn bowstring. But what she didn't know was that, while she wrestled with her restless thoughts, a man was silently making his way through the forest, carrying a truth that could change everything. Dr. Thomas Lang, a name erased from Genix's official records, is now returning like a ghost, bearing memories that had never truly slept. Thomas Lang was no stranger to the shadows. Before disappearing from the scientific world nearly a decade ago, he had been the lead architect of Phase 2 of Project Alpha Genesis, the man responsible for encoding the first hybrid genetic sequences between wolves and huskies. He was also the first to warn that without a spiritual bridge, these creatures would never achieve stability. When Genix dismissed his warnings, replacing empathy with control, Lang walked away. But he did not leave empty-handed. He had taken with him an ancient manuscript that Genix had buried, a weathered, time-worn document known as the Bridge Codex. Rachel opened the door before dawn, startled to find a man standing before her. Tall, gaunt, his face hollowed by time, yet his eyes still burning with sharp intellect. In his hand was a battered leather case, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, as if it had not been used in years. In that instant, she knew this was no ordinary man. "I am Thomas Lang," he said without preamble, "and if you don't listen to me right now, they will take the boy and Shadow before sunrise." In the small room behind the clinic, the dim glow of the desk lamp illuminated the aged brown pages that Lang spread out before them. Ancient handwriting, hand-drawn genetic symbols, depictions of humans and wolves standing beneath a full moon. Everything in the Bridge Codex seemed like a doorway to a forgotten world, one modern science had never been humble enough to acknowledge. Lang pointed to a particular page, where children with wolf-marked wrists stood beside wolves whose eyes mirrored Liam's, and Shadow's exactly. "The bridge gene was never something we created," he said slowly. "Genix only discovered it, hidden in an ancient bloodline, passed down through generations, unnoticed. The Codex records those rare individuals who possessed the ability to resonate with animal souls, especially wolves, the only species that has ever bonded with humans as equals." Rachel fell silent. Every word he spoke slashed through everything she had believed. That Shadow was merely an experiment, that Liam was just an anomaly. But now she was seeing it with her own eyes. Each symbol, each annotation, every word in the Bridge Codex pointing to one undeniable truth. The boy had been chosen, not by artificial design, but by a genetic memory that had endured through centuries. Lang continued, his voice grave. "I didn't come here to tell stories. Genix has already deployed a retrieval unit. They want to extract the bridge gene, map it completely, and then eliminate the host. Do you understand? Neither Liam nor Shadow is meant to survive once they get what they need." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "Then what do we do?" Lang reached into his case and pulled out a map of the forest behind Wild Haven. "The Codex isn't just a record," he said, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "It marks the location of an ancient ritual site, a place where a bridge pair can achieve a resonance so deep that no technology, no force, can ever separate them. But they have to reach it before Genix does." And so, in the lingering scent of damp pine, Rachel, the mother who had once known only syringes, heart monitors, and medical charts, now stood at the edge of a choice no one could have foreseen. To take her son and the creature the world called a monster into the forest, to seek out an ancient relic hidden within bloodlines and legend, in the desperate hope of saving not just them, but something sacred, something science had long forgotten. Outside, the pine grove stirred in the night. And at a hidden outpost, Genix's special operations team had just received new coordinates from the bio-tracking satellite. Ethan Rourke's eyes darkened as he read the name that had just surfaced. Dr. Thomas Lang. Re-emerged. The game had changed, and the one holding the map was no longer Genix, but the man who had once stood between light and shadow, the only one who understood that to reach the soul of the wolf, one could not use a cage. One had to walk with it. As night fell over Pine Grove, darkness stretched like a thick blanket over the treetops, the worn forest trails, and the unspoken instincts humans often ignored. In the isolation pen at the far end of Wild Haven, Shadow suddenly stood up. It didn't howl, didn't growl, just remained still for a few seconds. Its ears pricked forward, eyes wide open, its entire body trembling as if struck by an invisible wave, an ancient instinct stirring deep within its blood. It wasn't a sound. It was a signal, a silent call emerging from the core of its very being, triggered by pure, undiluted fear. Liam was in danger. Since reuniting with Liam, Shadow had never left Wild Haven. It had learned to live within barriers, within schedules, under the cautious gazes of scientists. But tonight, the forest beyond was no longer a distant boundary. It was an unavoidable destination. Because if Liam was in pain, Shadow felt it. If Liam panicked, Shadow could not remain still. With a powerful lunge, it slammed into the junction between two electrified fence posts, the very section engineers had deemed most secure. But they had not accounted for a creature driven by something far stronger than instinct, a heart burning with the need to protect. The electric grid flickered, sparked, then fractured, allowing a black silhouette to slip through like a phantom. For precisely 13 seconds, the security cameras experienced interference, just enough time for Shadow to vanish completely from the system. Only a faint alert flickered on the central control screen. Subject S7 has breached containment. Location? Unknown. In the main office, Margaret Ellis read the alert but did not immediately order a pursuit. Her intuition, honed through decades of working with wild animals, whispered a truth she could not ignore. It's not running away. It's searching for what belongs to it. She turned to Logan and murmured, "I'm not afraid of it being dangerous. I'm afraid someone else will be dangerous to it." While the Rangers were still organizing search teams, a separate tragedy was unfolding over 20 kilometers from Wild Haven. The Johnson family, 2 parents, and their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, had set up camp near the forest's edge when an unexpected downpour struck. In the chaos of packing up and relocating, Emily, enchanted by her paper lantern drifting in the wind, unknowingly wandered off into the darkened woods. By the time her mother realized she was missing, the flashlight had died, and their desperate calls were swallowed by the cold wind. Rescue teams were called in within 2 hours. Search dogs sniffed through the undergrowth, helicopters circled above the treetops, but all they found was a small fleece scarf lying at the edge of a stream. The rain poured down, the wind howled, and hope seemed to slip away until an old ranger named Howard Lang noticed something strange. Not human footprints, not the paw prints of a domestic dog. These were wolf tracks, large, deep, heading against the flow of the stream. His heart pounded as he followed the trail, doubt creeping into his mind. Then, pushing through a dense thicket, he suddenly froze. Beneath the massive trunk of an ancient fir tree, under a canopy of leaves forming a natural shelter, Emily lay fast asleep. Dry moss, leaves, and small branches had been carefully arranged over her tiny body, forming a makeshift blanket against the cold. But what made Howard hold his breath was the massive black shadow lying beside the girl, golden amber eyes watching his every move, not in fear, not in aggression, but with the gaze of a guardian. Howard slowly extended his hand and spoke gently. "It's all right. I'm a friend." The wolf didn't move, but after a few moments, it slowly rose to its feet, taking a few steps back, its gaze never leaving Emily. And just before it vanished into the forest, it lowered its head close to the ground. A silent farewell, a passing of trust. The story of the wolf that saved a child spread across the state within hours. The media called Shadow the guardian wolf. Public outcry erupted. How could a creature deemed dangerous become a hero? Animal rights activists demanded its release. Scientists began to question, was this truly just an animal, or something beyond biology itself? Yet, while the world debated, in a quiet wooden cabin on the outskirts of Pine Grove, Liam awoke from a mild fever. He said nothing. Instead, he reached for a crayon and, without hesitation, began drawing on a blank sheet of paper. A little girl sleeping beneath a great tree. Beside her, a black wolf covered in moss. Rachel stood behind him, her hands trembling as she took in the image. She turned to Lang, her voice barely above a whisper. "How does my son know this?" Lang tightened his grip on his wooden cane, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Shadow didn't escape," he said quietly. "Its soul awakened, and now the door between 2 worlds is beginning to open." Deep within the forest, Ethan Rourke, leader of the Gen X retrieval team, read the latest news about the guardian wolf with a twisted smile. "We don't need to track it anymore," he told his unit. "It will lead us to the boy on its own." In his hand, he held a small vial of deep red liquid, the first successfully cloned cells of the bridge gene. "Now," he muttered darkly, We just need 2 living samples." The next morning, before the public even had time to process the news of the black wolf saving a lost girl, something felt off in Wildhaven. The morning sunlight filtered thinner through the pine trees, and the forest birds were unusually quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath before something inevitable. At the outdoor therapy site, part of a special program designed for Liam, Rachel brought her son to the familiar camp, where gifted children could connect with nature through painting and gentle animal interaction. Shadow, still under observation after his escape, hadn't been brought back yet, but Rachel felt reassured. Security had been tightened, and this place lay deep within the sanctuary, a place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. That false sense of safety was the critical mistake. While Rachel and the staff prepared the next activity, Liam, only a few steps away, was approached by a shadow, fast as lightning, completely silent. A high-grade neural suppressant was injected into his arm in less than 2 seconds. He didn't even have time to scream. He collapsed, eyes wide in confusion, the last thing he saw being his unfinished sketch, a wolf running toward the moon. The man threw a black cloak over Liam, clipped a bio-signal blocker to his wrist, and vanished into the forest like a ghost. Minutes later, Rachel turned back and found only a sketchbook on the ground and a faint drag mark in the dry leaves. Liam was gone. No warning. No sound. No cry for help. Her heart pounded as she picked up the sketchbook. The pages were still warm, as if he had just been there. The sanctuary's alarm sounded. Margaret, Logan, and the entire team swept through the forest. But it was useless. Rachel screamed his name, stomped through brush and thorns, calling in desperation. Only the wind answered. And then Shadow appeared. Discovered near the western edge of the forest after its escape, it arrived at the alarm point without a leash, without command. It rushed straight to Liam's sketchbook, sniffed it gently, growled low, and then turned to Rachel. Its amber eyes blazed like fire. It knew. Liam had been taken. Rachel fell to her knees, hands covering her face. Shadow didn't howl, didn't panic. It circled the area where Liam had disappeared, nose close to the ground, tracking. At that moment, Joseph Greyfeather appeared, leaning on his staff, eyes thoughtful, as if listening to something buried in the earth. He closed his eyes and spoke quietly. They used the eastern path, the old hunter's trail. Only those who once lived in this forest would know it. Lang arrived next, unsurprised. When Margaret confirmed that the area's security cameras had experienced a data disruption right when Liam vanished, he knew. This was Genix. Not a violent attack, a clean extraction. Just like they did with experimental subjects. Sedate, neutralize, extract, disappear. "They've been watching for a long time," Lang said, eyes locked on the trees. "And now they have what they want. The bridge child. Alive." Rachel stood, voice trembling but firm. "Then I'll get my son back. Even if I have to walk into their den myself." There was no time to waste. Shadow had locked onto the trail, and without waiting for orders, it took off into the forest like a living arrow. Rachel ran after it, while Lang and Joseph quickly packed maps, bridge codex notes, and old-school bio-trackers. Genix couldn't jam. They had one shot. Stay ahead of Genix, find Liam before it was too late. Because if the bridge gene extraction was completed, what would be lost wasn't just a child. It would be the last link between humankind and a world on the edge of extinction. Meanwhile, inside an unmarked vehicle speeding down forest back roads, Liam lay motionless, a gene blocker strapped to his wrist. Beside him, Ethan Rourke replayed footage of Shadow saving the little girl and smirked. "Beautiful," he murmured. "But this time no one's calling you a hero. They'll call you the final product." The vehicle disappeared underground, heading straight for Genix's most secret facility, where everything humanity believed about limits was about to be shattered. Under the cold gray moonlight piercing through the thick forest canopy, Rachel's group, led by Shadow, followed closely by Joseph and Dr. Lang, moved swiftly along deserted trails, tracking faint biosignatures and lingering scent particles left behind by Liam, even through the signal blockers. The deeper they pushed into the southeast of Pine Grove, the quieter the forest became, unnaturally so, as if nature itself was holding back, disturbed by something foreign now occupying its ground. They stopped on a limestone slope where the thinning trees revealed a steel hatch buried beneath dead leaves, the entrance to Genix's underground facility. Lang stared down, breath heavy, heart pounding like ghosts from the past were waking up. He had walked into this place hundreds of times before, signed off on dozens of experimental specimens, but never thought the day would come when he'd break into it, not for science, but to save a child from becoming a living test subject. Rachel tightened the straps of the medical bag on her back, her eyes filled with resolve. And Shadow, the moment it neared this place, had transformed. Its body was taut, its spine lowered, its amber eyes blazing, no longer a companion, a warrior of the ancient wild. Using an old access code, Lang opened the first steel door, leading them into an abandoned service tunnel. From this point, all communication signals were cut. They moved in silence. Deep within the Genix base, Liam was restrained on a cryolab table, his wrists locked into DNA extraction devices. Dr. Marion Vall oversaw the procedure herself. She didn't need Liam awake. She only needed the bridge gene fully unlocked. On the monitoring screen, the gene sequence pulsed in red. Faint, steady, just a few strands away from full mapping. "All we need is one complete spinal sample," Marion whispered, eyes fixed on the screen. "And we can replicate thousands of resonant clones." Below, just as Rachel's group stepped into the main corridor, alarms blared. Not because they were detected, but because Shadow had triggered the biodetection system. 4 Alpha Canis Mk4 guard units, Genix's robotic hounds, activated from each end of the hallway. Built with titanium frames, thermal sensors, and advanced group coordination, they had never failed a breach simulation. But this time, they weren't facing a regular intruder. They were up against Shadow, the living spirit of the forest, the only creature with pure bridge-wolf blood. The robots launched like steel missiles, claws and metal jaws screeching, but Shadow didn't flinch. With precise, fluid strikes, it dodged attacks, flipped one bot onto the ground, and crushed its throat wires with its full weight. Sparks flew, metal shrieked. Then silence. Another lunged from behind, but Joseph hurled his carved wooden staff etched with old symbols. The staff disrupted its sensors, and Shadow leapt, twisting mid-air like a black flame, landing square on its back. The impact detonated the power core. Smoke filled the corridor. As Rachel and Lang cracked the security code for the last door, Shadow alone held off the remaining 3 units, not just with strength, but with instinct, targeting weak points, moving non-stop, never letting numbers overwhelm it. In less than 5 minutes, all 6 units lay dismantled. The final door opened. They stormed into the central lab. Liam lay prepped for spinal extraction, his face pale under the flickering glow of the gene scanner. His heart rate had dropped, suppressed by cell inhibitors. Rachel screamed, "Stop!" Marion turned, stunned. Before she could hit the emergency override, Shadow burst through the protective glass, landing directly on the control console. Its claws tore through the mainframe. Sparks exploded. The backup systems shorted. Liam slipped off the table, straight into Rachel's arms. Shadow stood between them and the threat, back arched, teeth bared, ready for more. Ethan Rourke charged in with a shock injector gun, but Lang stepped forward, blocking the aim. "Shoot me if you have to, but that child, if there's a shred of conscience left in you, let him live. He's a bridge, not a product." Marion, furious, understood. Genix had lost. The system was down. The bridge gene is incomplete, and the creature they dismissed as a tool had outwitted their entire defense grid, not with programming, but with a heart. Joseph approached Liam, gently placing a hand on the birthmark on his wrist. It glowed faint red, not from pain, but from life returning. Liam stirred, lips moving to whisper the only name that mattered. Shadow. In the flickering light of the failing systems, the group escaped through the emergency tunnel Lang once helped design, leaving Gen X in chaos behind them and a truth its members couldn't deny. They hadn't been beaten by a superior force, but by the one thing they forgot living beings possess: a heart capable of love. The northern emergency steel door burst open just as Rachel and Joseph pulled Liam out of the glowing corridor of alarms and warning lights. Behind them, in a haze of electrical smoke and shrieking sirens, a sharp metallic screech rang out. The final mechanical hound, the upgraded Alpha Canis MKV, had escaped central override. Though the command center was disabled, this unit operated on an autonomous survival response protocol, a contingency program designed to eliminate any subject linked to the bridge gene if recovery was impossible. With terrifying speed and a titanium shell built to resist ballistic fire, the machine didn't pursue with fury, but with singular, unflinching purpose: destruction. Before Rachel could turn, a massive black blur shot forward. Shadow leapt into the robot's path with a thunderous snarl that echoed down the cold steel corridor, intercepting its charge like a cannonball. The impact shattered a side wall, sending debris and sparks flying, and threw both Joseph and Liam violently to the ground. The robot rose almost immediately, red eyes blazing, targeting Liam. It raised a claw tipped with neurotoxin injectors, ready to deliver the fatal strike. But before it could lunge, Shadow, his black fur soaked in blood, summoned the last of his strength, slammed into the machine again, and clamped his jaws onto the hidden servo joint at the base of its neck, the core of its control system. A sickening crack followed. The robot let out a corrupted growl, then collapsed, sparking and twitching, before falling completely still. But as the smoke cleared, Rachel and Joseph froze. Shadow was motionless, lying in a widening pool of dark blood. His body trembled with weak spasms. His breaths were shallow. His amber eyes were half-closed, fading, as if drifting beyond the edge of life. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his chest. Her tears fell freely, and her voice broke as she sobbed. No, he saved my son. He can't die like this." Joseph stood in silence, eyes full of sorrow, nodding in what felt like a final goodbye to the wolf soul who had just sacrificed everything. Then, something shifted. Liam, recently stabilized with a temporary antidote administered by Lang, opened his eyes. He moved slowly to Shadow's side, gently pushing his mother's hands away. He said nothing. No words, no cries. He simply placed his small palm directly over Shadow's heart. His eyes opened wide, glowing faintly in the darkness, not from light, but from something deeper, something ancient and alive. And then, the bridge mark, the wolf-paw birthmark on Liam's wrist, began to glow. A soft red light pulsed from Liam's hand, not hot or blinding, but warm, like the first breath of life from a newborn creature. The glow seeped into Shadow's chest, spread through the blood-soaked fur, and something miraculous began to happen. Shadow's heart, silent seconds before, gave a faint thump, then another, then stronger. Breath returned. His chest rose, and slowly his amber eyes opened. He looked directly at Liam, whose hand remained over his heart. The wolf let out a quiet, almost reverent sound, not a whimper of pain, but something gentler, something that said, "I'm still here." Liam didn't answer. He only nodded. No words were needed. In that instant, the boy and hybrid were no longer separate. They had crossed into the final tier of bioempathic resonance, a state ancient Bridge Codex scrolls had only described in myth, resonantia vita, the resonance of life. Joseph, seeing with his own eyes what his ancestors had only ever dared imagine, clasped his hands together and murmured an old prayer in the language of the Highland tribes. Two souls, one heartbeat. If one lives, the other shall never fade. Lang, watching the light emanating from Liam's wrist, a type of biogenic energy that no instrument could measure, could only whisper, "We've just witnessed something science never defined, a miracle made of genes." For a moment, there were no gunshots, no smoke, no robots, no genics, only Liam and Shadow. Two hearts, one rhythm. A child once thought fragile had become the living pulse that restored a soul. And in the fading emergency light of the escape tunnel, they all knew the battle wasn't over. But the most important thing had been saved, a bond no one could break. Shadow slowly rose to his feet, still weak but standing. Liam reached for him, placing his small hand gently on the wolf's side, and together, boy and beast, they walked forward side by side, leaving behind the wreckage of a shattered Genix, and stepping into a destiny they would write themselves, in blood, in memory, and love. As darkness receded after the harrowing rescue, the group safely retreated from the Genix base through an old maintenance tunnel, one that Lang himself had designed during his years as a lead scientist. At the forest's edge, Rachel administered first aid to Shadow, while Liam, though still physically weak, had a newfound light in his eyes. There was depth, an awareness beyond mere recovery, as if the resonance between him and Shadow had done more than revive the wolf. It had awakened something sacred and profound within him. And in that quiet moment, as the forest wind rustled through towering trees, Dr. Thomas Lang opened the Bridge Codex for the first time with his heart, not just his intellect. No longer a scientist, now a man seeking redemption. Lang set the ancient book on the forest floor, its leather-bound pages illuminated by the flickering glow of the campfire. The weathered parchment bore faded inscriptions, lost for centuries. Beside him, Joseph Greyfeather assisted in deciphering the symbols, spirals representing the cycle of life, jagged lines symbolizing the convergence of the spirit world and the physical world. Then Lang turned to a page marked by an old red thread. The text was written in a blend of old Latin and indigenous symbols. His breath caught as he began translating, slowly, word by word, his eyes never leaving the manuscript. When the 13th moon completes its cycle across 200 seasons, a child bearing the mark will be born. They will not only carry the gene, but the living memory. Not only connect, but become one. They are the perfect bridge, the only ones who can open the gateway between the human world and the spirit world. If they awaken, the resonance will spread like moonlight rippling across a still lake. Silence fell over the group. Rachel gripped Liam's hand tightly. Joseph nodded, confirming what he had long suspected. "Liam is that child," Joseph murmured. "The bridge child is no longer a myth. It is real. And your son is the perfect bridge." Lang continued, his voice trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of revelation. The bridge cycle only appears every 200 years. The last recorded one was a young woman from the Lac Van tribe, who bore the same wolf's mark and once stopped a generations-long hunt of the white wolves. But when she disappeared, the resonance faded, until Liam was born. Rachel felt a surge of emotions. Pain for the years her son had been seen as different, pitied for his silence, and labeled as autistic by a world that failed to understand. But now that silence was not an absence. It was a space reserved for something sacred, a role the world had waited 2 centuries for. Joseph looked at Rachel, then at Shadow, who lay quietly by the fire, golden eyes fixed on Liam, not just as a companion, but as if recognizing that it had been revived not just by life, but by the return of a long-awaited cycle. "This child," Joseph said softly, "was not just born to connect with wolves. He was born to remind humanity of a truth we've long forgotten, that we were once a part of nature, not above it, not beneath it, but within it." Lang closed the Bridge Codex with a deep sigh, and Genex nearly tore that bond apart out of greed. That night, beneath a sky brimming with stars, beside a fire that flickered against the dark, no one spoke. Liam drifted into sleep, his small hand resting against Shadow's thick fur. And for the first time in all her years as a single mother, Rachel felt something beyond the burden of solitude. She felt purpose, a mission only her son could bear, with his heart, and with the wolf's mark written into his very blood. And far away, in the cold shadows where Genex had temporarily retreated, Marion Vall replayed the rescue footage, pausing at the exact moment Liam's glowing hand touched Shadow. She did not rage. She only whispered, "The perfect bridge has emerged, but this cycle will not end like the last." The aftermath of the breathless rescue and the life resonance between Liam and Shadow still rippled silently through Wild Haven, like a wave of invisible energy brushing every tree and stone. While Genex was forced to retreat, stripped of their data and the living center of their project, something far greater was quietly preparing to unfold in a place far beyond test tubes, surveillance, or gene sequences, the Blood Moon ritual. Once Liam's strength began to return and Shadow was able to walk again, with Ember never leaving his side, Joseph Greyfeather approached Rachel. His expression was serious, his voice low but firm. "Tomorrow night is the Blood Moon, the final red moon of this cycle. If we don't perform the moon binding, the resonance between Liam and Shadow will begin to destabilize. They've surpassed the physical limits of any species, and that imbalance could destroy them from within." Rachel froze. Lang looked at Joseph, concern etching his voice. "You mean if we don't do this, they could?" "Not just collapse," Joseph nodded grimly, "but be drained completely. Resonance without guidance becomes dissonance. And when that happens, Liam won't just lose Shadow. He'll lose himself." No further explanation was needed. Everyone understood. Resonance was a gift, but also a burden, and only the old traditions knew how to carry it properly. The next night, the sky was clear, the moon rising high and deep red like blood bleeding into silence. Beneath it, Joseph and his native tribe erected the Spirit Stone Circle, a sacred site used only for rare ancestral ceremonies reserved for the Bridge Ones. It stood on the western edge of Wild Haven, on flat earth surrounded by ancient forest and crystal-clear streams, where even wild beasts dared not tread under the red moon's gaze. Liam wore a hand-stitched ceremonial cloak embroidered with symbols of wolves dancing with the wind. Rachel sat outside the circle, clutching Lang's hand. Both adults knew the truth. Tonight, they were not the center. Tonight belonged to three souls: Liam, Shadow, and Ember. Shadow, though not fully healed, walked into the center of the circle with slow, proud steps. A red, sacred cloth was tied around his dark fur, the mark of a returned guardian. Ember, small but steady, followed on her own without guidance. And Liam, the boy who once lived in silence, walked like someone entirely new. Not just a gifted child, but the complete bridge, the once-in-2 centuries heartbeat of an ancient cycle. Joseph began the ritual with an ancestral chant. No lyrics, just deep, resonant tones like waves echoing inside the chest. He scattered sacred dust, ground from fir bark and the ashes of an ancient white wolf, over the stone ring. When the three stood in the perfect triangle, Liam at the apex, Shadow to the left, Ember to the right, Joseph raised the staff of his ancestors high toward the sky and called out, "The blood moon has risen. 3 heartbeats, 1 soul. Hear the voice of the forest. Listen to the echo of your ancestors in your marrow. Let past, present, and future merge into one." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The wolf paw birthmark on Liam's wrist began to glow, a deep red light reflecting the crimson moon above. Simultaneously, a pulse of light radiated from Shadow's chest in rhythm with his heart, while a soft mist-like glow of pale blue spread gently from Ember's eyes. The 3 streams of light converged at the center of the stone ring, creating a swirling spiral on the ground, where the earth itself seemed to beat like a buried heart waking from slumber. Liam didn't flinch. He reached out, placing one hand gently on Ember's forehead and the other on Shadow's shoulder. And in that instant, a strange wind swept through the forest, not strong, not cold, but like the brush of a hand over skin. Everyone watching around the ring bowed their heads, whispering prayers in an old tongue that had no translation. Joseph lowered the ancestral staff. His voice now seemed to rise from the earth itself. The resonance is complete, the bridge is sealed, blood has joined, breath has merged. From this night on, they are no longer just human, nor wolf, but 3 heartbeats, 1 living soul. The spiral of light slowly faded. Ember gently licked Liam's hand before curling up in his lap. Shadow raised his head, not with the burning fire of a warrior, but with the quiet gaze of a guardian who had fulfilled his sacred vow. Lang whispered, "We just witnessed a triadic resonance, but no machine could measure this. Only a heart could feel it." Rachel's tears fell, not from fear or grief, but from something pure, joy. For the first time since the day her son was born, Liam was no longer alone. And more importantly, he was not just being protected. He was protecting something too, something sacred, something the world had forgotten. Above them, the blood moon still hung in the sky, but its light no longer felt heavy. It felt lifted, as if even the moon had sighed in relief, knowing the forest had reclaimed its rhythm through 3 souls and 1 shared heartbeat. The night after the blood moon, once the moon-binding ritual was complete and the resonance between Liam, Shadow, and Ember had been sealed by an ancient soul thread, Dr. Thomas Lang sat by the fire until dawn, eyes fixed on pages of biomedical notes and genetic data cross-referenced with the Bridge Codex. As the first light broke over the pines of Pine Grove, he looked up, voice tight with emotion. "It's time we do what no one has ever dared before. The first cross-species stem cell transplant in history." Rachel and Joseph stood stunned. Lang set down his pen and handed over the latest genetic results. The bridge gene segments in Liam and Shadow weren't just similar. They shared codon matches in exact positions. "It's as if," he explained, "2 beings of different species were carrying pieces of each other in their blood. This isn't chance. This is structural destiny." Rachel's heart pounded, but she nodded. Because for weeks, Liam had been fading. Leukemia was quietly stealing the life from her son, cell by cell. And Shadow, too, had begun to lose fur, eat less, and breathe harder. They were both weakening, not from lack of treatment, but because their resonance needed a biological anchor to survive. Lang began preparations. Wildhaven went into temporary lockdown. A semi-field surgical suite was set up, equipped with advanced devices flown in from research institutes where Lang had once worked. An elite team of transplant surgeons and veterinary specialists was brought in, under one strict condition: no press, no disclosure, no questions. That morning, a light rain fell, steady, quiet, as if the sky itself trembled before a moment never recorded in medical history. A stem cell transplant from a wild creature to a human, and back again. Shadow was placed under light anesthesia and lay to the right of the surgical bay, his heart slow but steady. Liam, thinner than ever from weeks of treatment, was stabilized and prepped on the left. Neither spoke, neither looked at the other, but their heart monitors slowly began to sync, pulse for pulse, as if they had agreed without a word. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Bone marrow was carefully extracted from Shadow, filtered, and processed in a high-containment genetic chamber, then introduced into Liam's body through a central IV line in tightly controlled doses. Simultaneously, stem cells from Liam's marrow were isolated and prepared for reverse transplantation into Shadow. A process Lang admitted was possibly madness, but the only miracle we have left. When the procedure ended, both fell into deep comas. Their vitals were unstable, blood pressure low, white cells stagnant, breathing erratic. Whispers of failure circled the room. Some began preparing for the worst. Rachel didn't leave Liam's bedside for a second. Ember lay curled against Shadow, letting out soft, low whimpers, as if calling out to a spirit drifting too far. 3 days passed. No change. On the 4th night, in the dim stillness of the recovery ward, Liam moved a finger. A monitor let out a sudden ping. Rachel clutched his hand, whispering his name. Liam didn't open his eyes, but his lips moved, just enough to form a single word. Shadow. At that same moment, in the veterinary isolation unit, Shadow, still stitched and weak, lifted his head. His ears twitched, and then he opened his eyes. No one could believe it. Joseph exhaled, eyes wide. The connection was never broken. It was just waiting to be reawakened through blood, through living cells. Lang stepped back, clutching the medical file, eyes red from exhaustion. His voice no longer carried the tone of a scientist, but of someone who had witnessed something holy. We didn't perform medicine tonight. We walked into myth. The surgery was a success. But more than survival, it proved something greater, that between humankind and nature, there isn't just coexistence, there can be healing, if only we learn to listen to the heartbeat of another species. And from that day on, the limits of medicine no longer held, because the world now knew a boy and a wolf had returned from the edge of life and death by carrying each other's heartbeat home. The moment Liam's finger twitched and Shadow's amber eyes cracked open in the veterinary isolation ward, everything at Wild Haven seemed to shift. Doctors, volunteers, and caretakers held their breath, eyes locked on the vital monitors. Rachel, exhausted after so many sleepless nights, refused to look away from her son. Joseph and Lang stood just outside the two-way observation glass, guarding the sacred stillness of a space where two souls had just returned from the brink of death. At dawn, as fog still clung to the tall pine branches and condensation gathered on the recovery room window panes, Liam suddenly opened his eyes completely. There was no fear in them, no confusion. He simply stared at the ceiling with a calm, grounded expression. Rachel burst into tears and wrapped her arms around him, but Liam gently touched her wrist and whispered, his voice faint yet clear, as though carrying a lifeline from the depths of his being. He's awake. For a moment, the recovery room froze in time. The machines, the data, the clinical procedures, none of it mattered. No one spoke. There was only the sparkle in Liam's eyes, shining toward something beyond the wall, something unseen. And on the other side, in perfect synchrony, Shadow opened his eyes. Two beings, two lives, two heartbeats thought lost, returned together, their rhythm reborn in perfect unity. Rachel clutched her son's hand, weeping, but this time not from fear. These were tears of release, of truth confirmed in a way science couldn't explain, through resonant revival. Joseph Greyfeather stood in the doorway, nodding slowly, his eyes distant, as though seeing echoes of an ancestral memory rise again from the soil. In a voice like wind over ancient stone, he whispered, "When two souls breathe as one, no death can divide them." In the adjacent recovery room, Shadow rose on shaky legs, his blood still recalibrating, but his amber eyes had regained their depth, not clouded, not dulled, but bright and aware, locked onto the hallway where Liam rested. Then, in a deliberate motion, Shadow bowed his head once, gently, a gesture not of submission, but of recognition, as if greeting an old friend after a long journey. That simple nod made the entire room exhale all at once. Lang, who had worn the unshaken mask of a scientist for years, took off his glasses, wiping his eyes on the sleeve of his lab coat. Not from sorrow, but because history had just been rewritten. Not in numbers, but in love. He stepped beside Joseph and said, hoarsely, "I used to believe DNA explained everything, but maybe it's the heart that decides what lives forever." What followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Liam's white blood cell count, previously plummeting due to leukemia, now climbed steadily. The stem cells transplanted from Shadow didn't just survive. They fused with Liam's biology in a way never documented, creating what Lang later called resonant blood. At the same time, Shadow's decline reversed. His fur regained its sheen, wounds healed swiftly, and most remarkably, his wolf physiology now appeared shielded by traces of Liam's human immune markers. It was a miracle forged not in theory, but in shared breath. Soon, Rachel allowed Liam to walk outdoors again. No wheelchair, no machines, just Ember padding at his side. Shadow, now freed from his bio-monitoring collar, resumed his gentle patrols along the forest's edge. Sometimes, he lay beside Liam in silence. Other times, he ran alongside Ember like part of a new kind of pack, not bonded by blood, but by something older and deeper, a shared soul in 3 forms. One early spring afternoon, under golden honey light filtering through the trees, Liam sat sketching on the wooden porch of Wild Haven. Shadow rested his head in Liam's lap, and Ember curled beside them. Flipping to a new page in his notebook, Liam looked up at Rachel, who was brewing tea nearby. "I want to make a book," he said. "Not a fairy tale, a real one. So someone out there, someone who's different like me, will know there's a place a wolf and something waiting for them." Rachel placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her voice caught in her throat. She understood. Liam didn't dream of being normal again. He never had. What he wanted, what he had always needed, was to live fully, as the boy the world once misunderstood. The boy whose so-called flaw had become the reason life returned to more than just him. Ember perked her ears and gave Liam's hand a gentle lick. Shadow rose slowly and turned toward the deeper forest, alert and listening. Rachel smiled. "Maybe he hears the forest calling again." Liam shook his head softly, then answered, his voice more certain than it had ever been. "It's not the forest calling him, it's him listening to his own heart." And as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning Wild Haven to gold, they saw him, a boy once labeled severely autistic, now walking with steady steps down the forest trail, a wolf risen from death beside him, and a young cub bearing the legacy of a miracle. They said nothing. They didn't need to explain, because from that moment on, the world would know. Miracles are real, and sometimes they look like a boy laying his hand on a wolf's chest at the edge of death and saying, "Wake up, you're not done yet." The revival of Liam and Shadow wasn't the end of a miraculous journey, but the beginning of something greater. A new chapter filled with hope, written from the heart of the forest and the hearts of children once labeled as silent. Watching Liam's extraordinary recovery, his silent communication with Shadow and Ember, and, more than anything, the way he opened himself to the world with quiet tenderness toward wild creatures, Rachel, Joseph, and Lang all came to the same conclusion. This was never just the story of one boy and a wolf. Not long after, with the support of conservation authorities and specialists in psychology and biomedical fields, Wild Haven officially launched a special initiative called BRIDGE, short for Biological Resonance for Integrative Development, Growth, and Empathy. It became the world's first program built around the natural bond between neurodivergent children, including those with autism and PTSD, and wild animals that had been rehabilitated or raised through bioempathic pairing. Unlike traditional therapy models involving dogs or horses, BRIDGE wasn't based on obedience or training. It was rooted in natural empathy, a space where humans weren't there to fix animals, but to be healed by their pure, wordless presence. And at the center of this program, they didn't place a renowned psychologist or a department head. Instead, they entrusted it to a 6-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word for the first 3 years of his life, Liam Carter. At first, many objected. They said he was too young. They said, "He doesn't have credentials." But Joseph simply answered, "This boy is the only person in the world who once brought a wolf back to life with nothing but his hand and his heart. So tell me, why can't he help another child believe they deserve to be heard?" And so Liam began his new role, not as a healer in the clinical sense, but as a quiet guide. A boy who sat beside another child who wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond, and instead of asking questions, just sat there, sometimes for hours. Sometimes he simply let Ember or Shadow curl up next to the child, licking their hand softly, and slowly, something remarkable would happen. The child began to return to life, not through words, but through feeling. A little girl with PTSD, who hadn't slept through the night in 2 years, began to smile again after 3 quiet drawing sessions under the trees beside Shadow. A boy with autism, who once panicked at loud sounds, learned to calm himself by holding Ember close when he was afraid. As for Liam, the boy who once filled his sketchbooks with nothing but lonely wolf tracks, he began drawing faces, smiles, eyes, hands reaching for one another. Lang continued to oversee the program's biological aspects, while Rachel handled medical management. But both agreed, Bridge was not an intervention model. It was a living resonance, a space where people didn't try to repair broken spirits, but learned to listen to them. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the distant pines, Rachel spotted Liam showing 3 children how to use simple hand signals to speak to Ember. He didn't say much, just demonstrated, repeated patiently, and waited. When one of the children mimicked the gesture, Ember responded immediately, lying down and resting her head in the child's lap. The child froze, then began to cry, not out of fear, but because, for the first time, a creature had accepted them without needing words or understanding, just presence. Rachel turned away, tears slipping down her cheek. But it wasn't sadness. She knew this program wasn't only healing others. It was how Liam was rewriting his own story, not with words, not with language, but with the purest thing a human can offer, the ability to love without reason. And so Wild Haven, once a refuge surrounded by suspicion and fear, became a bridge, a sanctuary between wounded souls and the wild world that had never judged them. And Liam, the boy who once feared stepping beyond his safety circle, became the one leading others into their hearts without saying a word, only to whisper with his presence, "I understand, because I was once just like you." The following spring, as Pine Grove Forest began shedding the last traces of ice and sunlight streamed through the tender green canopy, the BRIDGE program entered its first full year, with results far beyond what anyone had dared to expect. Children who once hid inside cocoons of silence were now laughing, running freely beside gentle, rehabilitated wild animals. In the middle of that ordinary, peaceful rhythm, during a quiet afternoon after group activities, a moment occurred, one so small, yet it made Rachel's heart stop amid the rustling leaves. Liam was seated beneath a great fir tree on the edge of the forest, sketching in his old leather notebook, the one he used to document hand signals, emotions, images, and the resonances between children and animals. Ember, now grown into a graceful and powerful young she-wolf, approached him from behind in complete silence. No sound, no call. She placed one front paw gently on Liam's leg, light as wind brushing across still water, a gesture that seemed instinctive, but mirrored exactly what Shadow had done on the very first day they met, back at the iron fence. Liam stopped drawing. He looked down at her paw, then into her deep amber-brown eyes. 1 second, 2. Then he smiled, not broadly but with just enough light to awaken something old and precious in the eyes that had once known only stillness. He touched her paw gently and whispered, just loud enough for the breeze to carry it away. "She knows, she remembers. The red thread is still here." In the distance, Rachel stood silently among the volunteers, one hand over her chest as she watched. That touch, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message passed down from a soul across generations, a living echo of something Joseph had once said, "Resonance doesn't die. It passes on from one generation to the next, like an ancient drumbeat that never truly stops." That evening, Liam led a group of 8 children across a shallow stream, following the trail he and Shadow had walked together during their earliest days of training. No one spoke much, just the sound of footsteps and birds calling from the deeper woods. When they reached a mossy clearing, Liam turned, standing at the center of the circle, still holding Ember's leash in one hand. And in a voice clear, steady, but laced with softness, he said, "Sometimes, we're born different, not because we're broken, but because we're meant for something greater." He knelt, picked up a leaf shaped like a wolf's paw, and placed it into the hand of a trembling boy at the edge of the group. Being different isn't a barrier, it's a key, and when you find the right door, you'll know why you've carried it with you all along. The children looked at one another, then at Ember, who calmly stepped forward, lay down beside Liam, and wagged her tail in a slow rhythm. A quiet girl stepped forward, gently touched Ember's back, then laughed. For the first time in 3 months, she laughed. The sound was light, but it rang through the trees. One by one, the others followed, laughing, reaching out, gathering around Liam, no longer afraid, no longer hiding. From a distance, Joseph and Lang stood under the shade of an old pine. Lang whispered, "This isn't a program anymore. This is living legend." Joseph nodded, his eyes shining. A legend written by a boy and a wolf. Through the hearts of souls the world never stopped long enough to hear. And so, as the sun dipped behind the far-off ridges, casting gold and amber across Pine Grove, they saw the silhouette of a brown-haired boy walking among a group of children. At his side was a young wolf with keen, knowing eyes. And farther off, the forest wind stirred again, like a forgotten song returning with the seasons, from Shadow to Liam to Ember, and one day beyond. Because resonance is not just a phenomenon, or a therapy, or a miracle, it is a legacy. The story of Liam, Shadow, and Ember is not simply about overcoming illness or breaking the limits of science. It is a gentle reminder that sometimes what saves a soul isn't a word, but a glance, a quiet gesture, or a heartbeat shared with another living being. From silence, they created a resonance that echoed through Pine Grove, and far beyond, into our hearts. If you ever had the chance to connect with an animal the way Liam did with Shadow, what kind would it be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need a little hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of wonder, courage, and connection. Thank you for listening.